After the Cold War, the United States established a security strategy based on global primacy. That is security dependent on the US being the dominant state in all corners of the world, so that no other centers of powers could even aspire to challenge it. Now, over time, the predictable would happen. The US would exhaust itself from within, and new powers would begin to develop at the periphery, which would collectively balance the United States. This balancing did occur, again, predictably from the Eurasian continent, with China and Russian cooperation at the center. Now, the strategy for the United States to restore its unipolar hegemonic status was to bleed and weaken Russia, that is, to knock it out from the ranks of great powers, which would allow it to shift its focus on confronting China. This was to a large extent why the NATO countries supported the coup in Ukraine in 2014. This is why the NATO countries undermined the Minsk Agreement for 7 years. And this is why NATO countries contributed to forcing Zelensky to abandon his peace mandate in 2019 when he won a staggering 73% of the vote on the peace platform. And this is why NATO refused to give Russia any security guarantees in 2021, despite knowing that Russia would use military force otherwise. And the former US ambassador to NATO, who participated in the negotiations around Ukraine, he argued in June of 2021 that it was better for the Biden-Putin talks not to go anywhere because, quote, success is confrontation. Now, my focus here is what happened next, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which had the objective of restoring Ukraine's neutrality, and also how NATO countries sabotage this peace as well in order to pursue a long war. So both Russia and Ukraine both wanted an immediate end to the war from day one when Russia invaded. That is, Russia demanded that Ukraine would have to restore its neutrality, and Ukraine was prepared to meet this term. Now, already on the first day after the invasion, that is on February 25th, 2022, Zelensky confirmed that, quote, today we heard from Moscow that they still want to talk. They want to talk about Ukraine's neutral status. Then later goes on, we are not afraid to talk about neutral status. On the third day, after the invasion, on 27th of February 2022, Ukraine and Russia agreed to hold peace talks without any preconditions. The US, however, insisted on a long war and did not support these negotiations. In late March 2022, Zelensky gave an interview to The Economist magazine where he stated the following, quote, there are those in the West who don't mind a long war because it would mean exhausting Russia, even if this means the demise of Ukraine and comes at the cost of Ukrainian lives.
Я думаю, що у всіх різні інтереси. Причому у всіх у Заходу є ті, хто хоче, щоб ця війна йшла довго. Тому що це буде виснаження Росії, але ціною України, ціною життя людей. Це точно вигідно деяким країнам.
The US suggested on the 21st of March 2022 that they may not be able to support Zelensky's peace negotiations as the war was much bigger than Ukraine. That is, universal principles had to be defended.
In the first part, I asked you to clarify, what are you saying about your support for a negotiated settlement a la Zelensky, but on whose principles?
So the point I was trying to make at least, is that this is a war that is in many ways bigger than Russia. It's bigger than Ukraine, however important and however monumental the stakes are in this, in President Putin's war against Ukraine. The key point is that there are principles that are at stake here that have universal applicability everywhere, whether in Europe, whether in the Indo-Pacific, anywhere in between. And
the day after, on 22nd of March 2022, Neil Ferguson published an article in Bloomberg in which he outlined that after interviews with American and British officials, he can conclude that the Americans and British had decided to go for a long war, to bleed Russia dry. The UK and US wanted, quote, the conflict to be extended and thereby bleed Putin. And why? Well, because the purpose now was, quote, the only end game now is the end of the Putin regime. So the Ukrainians could be used as an instrument to bring down Russia. Well, the negotiations nonetheless took place, but eventually they ended, as Ukraine was convinced by its Western partners to withdraw from the talks. The Turkish foreign minister explained that Ukraine and Russia were close to a deal. However, some NATO countries want the Russia-Ukraine war to prolong, so Russia gets weaker. The other mediator, which were the Israelis, confirmed the same. That is, Israel's former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was part of the negotiation, argued that both sides, that is both the Russians and Ukrainians, quote, very much wanted a ceasefire. However, he recognized that this had been blocked by the US and the UK. Bennett went on to say that there was, quote, a decision by the West to keep striking Putin, that is, instead of accepting peace.
נגיד את זה בצורה הרחבה, אני חושב שהייתה החלטה של המערב לגיטימית, שכרגע צריך להמשיך להכות בפוטין ולא להגיע.
אבל מה זה להכות בפוטין? פוטין ניקה באוקראינה, לא?
שנייה, לא, בסדר, אבל שאל מול, זאת אומרת, הגישה היותר תקיפה, כן. אני אגיד לך משהו, אני לא יודע להגיד שהם שגו.
כי אתה אומר, אולי בריונים אחרים בעולם היו רואים את זה.
העמדה שלי באותו הזמן, בעניין הזה זה לא אינטרס לאומי ישראלי.
כן.
בשונה מקונסוליה או איראן, שאני דואג לישראל, עומד חזק פה,
כן.
אין לי סי. אני בסך הכל
כן.
מוציא לפועל ומתווך, אבל הכתובת שלי זה אמריקה בעניין הזה, ואני לא פועל על דעת עצמי. כל פעולה שעשיתי הייתה מתואמת לפרטי פרטים, גם עם ארצות הברית, גם עם גרמניה, גם עם צרפת.
אז הם בעצם חדלו את זה?
בגדול, כן. בגדול הם חדלו את זה, ובאותו זמן חשבתי שהם שוגים.
Now these conclusions were also shared by the retired German general Harald Kujat, who was the former head of the German's Bundeswehr and also former chairman of NATO's military committee. And he also could confirm that the war had been deliberately provoked by NATO, while the US and the UK then went on to sabotage all paths to peace to, quote, weaken Russia politically, economically, and militarily.
And that's why, in the Ukraine war, the United States aims to weaken Russia, its second geopolitical rival, politically, economically, and militarily, to such an extent that they can focus on the confrontation with China, their biggest adversary. To achieve their strategic goal, the United States has sought close cooperation with Europe. Especially in the current federal government, they have found not just a willing ally. This chancellor, as his visit on Friday to Washington shows, is apparently also ready to take on a leadership role in the Ukrainian proxy war. However, it should be considered that the European allies, just like in the Ukraine war, are also intended to be involved in a future conflict with China. Together with Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, they are supposed to form an Indo-Pacific network of partners and allies against China. One might think this is a clever move by the United States, to first strike Russia the weaker of the two geopolitical rivals, and then, in a proxy war, of course, not directly, to then turn to China, the stronger opponent. However, like the American strategy expert Harlan Ullman, I believe that the USA is making a big mistake by opening a strategic military two-front confrontation against China and Russia. Harlan Ullman described this as a ticking time bomb.
And the US Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, also outlined the US objective in the Ukraine war as weakening Russia as a strategic rival.
We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. So it has already lost a lot of military capability and a lot of its troops, quite frankly. And we want to see them not have the capability to very quickly reproduce that capability. We want to see the international community more united, especially NATO.
A strategy for restoring American dominance was therefore frequently articulated by various American leaders. That is, the US would use Ukrainians to weaken Russia, which would allow for the US to focus its resources on confronting China instead. The long war in Ukraine would also strengthen the arms industry in the United States, of course. And this sentiment was summarized by Senator Dan Crenshaw, who wrote on Twitter that investing in the destruction of our adversary's military without losing a single American troop strikes me as a good idea. Senator Mitch McConnell argued he argued, at least attempted to reassure people that this was not some idealist crusade for the bleeding hearts. Instead, it was about cold, hard American interests.
And let's be clear. The reason that a big bipartisan majority of the American people and a big bipartisan majorities in Congress support continuing to assist Ukraine is not primarily about inspiring speeches or a desire to engage in philanthropy. The Ukrainian people are courageous and innocent, and they deserve our help. President Zelensky is an inspiring leader. But the most basic reasons for continuing to help Ukraine degrade and defeat the Russian invaders are cold, hard, practical American interests.
Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham, that is, argued that the great deal America achieved was to get Zelensky to commit to fight to the last Ukrainian if NATO would continue to send weapons.
I like the structural path we're on here. As long as we help Ukraine with the weapons they need and the economic support, they will fight to the last person. I like the structural path we're on here. As long as we help Ukraine with the weapons they need and the economic support, they will fight to the last person. I like the structural path we're on.
Then we have Senator Mitt Romney as well, who was the Republicans' presidential candidate in 2008, who also recognizes that this is a very cheap way of knocking out a key rival of the United States without losing American troops, instead fighting with Ukrainians, and this would allow the United States to instead focus on its main adversary, which is China.
The single most important thing we can do to strengthen ourselves relative to China is to see Russia defeated in Ukraine, because they are allies, and Russia being weakened weakens their ally China. I mean, so and by the way, being able to take an amount which equals what, about 5% of our military budget, but actually less than 5% of our military budget each year to help the Ukrainians is about the best national defense spending I think we've ever done. We're losing no lives in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are fighting heroically against Russia that has 1,500 nuclear weapons aimed at us. It's like, so we're diminishing and devastating the Russian military for a very small amount of money relative to what we spend in the rest of defense. A weakened Russia is a good thing. It tells China to rethink their territorial ambition.
Then there's retired General Keith Kellogg, arguing in favor of using Ukrainians to defeat Russia as a strategic rival. Again, so the US can instead focus on China.
Thank you, Senator. Senator, I believe if you can defeat a strategic adversary not using any U.S. troops, you're at the acme of professionalism, because letting the Ukrainians defeat that, it takes a strategic adversary off the table, and then we can focus where we should be focusing against our primary adversary, which is China at this time. The concern I've got is I don't think we need to put American troops there, and if we fail in this, we may have to fight another European war. It'll be the third time. And I don't think we should do that or need to do that as well.
I posted the comments of General Kellogg on Twitter, and General Kellogg was polite enough to respond to my tweet, in which he compared his approach to the ideas of Sun Tzu in The Art of War, in which he wrote that the greatest victory is that which requires no battle. Kellogg may be reading Sun Tzu wrong, that is, starting a proxy war against the world's largest nuclear power, which will compel Russia, whose main foreign policy objective used to be integration with the West, to instead align itself with China, is not necessarily the thoughts or ideas that Sun Tzu had in mind. Now, as we know, NATO has lost the proxy war, and General Kellogg was since put on Trump's negotiation team, which aims to restore good relations with Russia. And as Kellogg argues now, the goal should be to encourage Russia to move away from its alliances with Iran and China.
Now what we're going to do is try to break this alliance that he currently has. He's got an alliance around with North Korea that wasn't there before. He's got an alliance with Iran that wasn't there before. He's got an alliance with China that wasn't there before, meaning 4 years ago. Now what we're going to do is try to break.
And indeed, we also saw the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, as he advocated for renewed interest in the war in the United States, where he tried to convince his partners in America that continuing the war was actually a good thing, because as long as, if the war continues, this will help to feed the American arms producers. It will also leave a very battle-hardened Ukrainian army on the defeated Russian border, which would allow them to contain the Russians, while the US could then focus its energy and resources on China.
And this is actually a good deal, because we, by using a fraction of the US defense budget, we have been able to destroy and degrade the Russian army substantially. And therefore we should continue to do so, because not least knowing that most of this money is actually spent in the United States. We buy US weapons to support Ukraine. This secures jobs in America and makes us all safer.
So the long war was sold under the narrative of Russia simply having an unprovoked invasion just to conquer some new territories. For 3 years, NATO rejected any negotiations and boycotted all diplomacy. And Zelensky even put out a decree which made it illegal to even negotiate with Russia. Having severed all possible paths to a peaceful settlement, NATO committed itself to sending all the weapons that Ukraine needed in order to defeat Russia. And NATO continued to make the threat that once the war was over, Ukraine would become a NATO member, which made it impossible for Russia to withdraw as well, as Russia considers NATO expansion to Ukraine to be an existential threat. As the NATO Secretary General announced that weapons are the path to peace, Russia was only given the option of either capitulation in a war which it considers to be an existential threat, or fight in a very bloody war of attrition, as NATO would stand on the sideline shedding some crocodile tears. Now, the war propaganda also made sure that anyone calling for peace negotiations in Ukraine could be denounced as a traitor, someone who wanted to reward and embolden Putin, and also it entailed betraying Ukraine. However, as we know, in November of 2024, a Gallup poll was released which demonstrated that the majority of Ukrainians not only want peace and negotiations, but they're also willing to accept territorial concessions to get peace. Yet, for the Europeans, even sitting down and speaking with Russia is still sold to the public as being a betrayal of Ukraine. And this is the narrative of a long war. And in the beginning of 2025, the former advisor of Zelensky, Alexei Arestovich, wrote on X that the countries that did not let us negotiate a peace 3 years ago still don't let us end the war.